There are numerous possibilities, and I have a long list of them. I hope to look at them in future work on this project. But for now, I will go over two brief examples, I suppose. So first of all, the use of wordplay can actually allow us to look deeper into the translations than one place where this is very clear is in cases where it looks like we should have some sort of pun, but there's not one that sort of obviously presents itself. So in this case, we have the offering formula followed by an offering. And then in the offering, we simply have a single logogram. So the reading is really a bit ambiguous, but it's sort of natural just to read this as te, because that's the most common word for bread, and that's really the best we can do without further information. But if we consider another example in which the word depit, meaning taste, is paired with depet, which is a different sort of bread, we can consider whether this might actually be the word bread that's being used in the other spell. So perhaps instead of te, we should read this logogram as depet, which creates wordplay with the word dep in the previous line. There are a lot of cases like this where you have an offering formula or a name formula and no obvious pun. So one of the things that I think really stands out when you look at the map of the different types of wordplay is that they tend to be grouped in large clusters, especially offering formulas. Those are all grouped together at the beginning with one small area of them toward the end. But this figure is actually a bit misleading at this level of resolution. If I zoom in on the offering formulas at the beginning, you can see that there are actually large gaps in here where there aren't puns. But the offering formula is still present. There's simply no pun that obviously presents itself. So my hypothesis is that we could look at these examples again and perhaps find evidence for other sorts of wordplay that isn't obvious from the consonantal stems, such as vowel prosody or rhyme or something of that sort. I personally believe that more sophisticated statistical analysis is needed of these data before we can really say how to deal with cases where there isn't wordplay, but that's something I hope to do in the future. And actually, one of the reasons that I started on this project was, one, because puns are very interesting, I think, and also because it gave me the opportunity to really dig into this data and organize it for the purpose of creating a comprehensive database of the pyramid text to explore questions like this further with statistics and that sort of thing. So I believe that the evidence provided by puns might offer a unique opportunity to gain new insights into the phonology of Old Egyptian.
Okay, 4 minutes early, so that means we have 24 minutes. Or no, wait, don't listen to my math. We have time for questions. So
go for it, 24 minutes. Any questions? Yes, sir?
Yeah. One question is whether you draw a distinction between puns and alliteration. It seems like in some of your examples, you see there's definite double meaning attached to the two words. But in other cases, like, the shoe raises himself, it seems to be just a question of using sounds or effect without producing a double meaning. Are you conflating those, or are you going to draw a distinction between those two different things?
In this talk, I'm definitely conflating them because I wanted to cover as much of the material as possible without spending a huge amount of time talking about the different sorts of wordplay. So it was definitely there's definitely a sort of mixing of all the different types in what I presented here, but that was just in the interest of time. In the actual study, I've created a number of different types of wordplay that differentiated.
Can I ask another question?
Sure.
Totally different. It's personally interesting to me, and again, in 20 minutes you can't go into this, but have you thought about how close words have to be in their sound before you can draw that parallel? And I mean, the classic pun that everybody knows about is the pun on remech and remove for people in tears, where there's apparently that big T sound in the middle of remech, but yet the Egyptians obviously saw that as a pun because they used that pair constantly. how far away can you get? How many extra consonants or how much sort of phonetic divergence can there be before you see a pun?
I think that's an excellent question. It's actually one of my questions as well, and that's one of the things that I'm hoping to look at in a more rigorous way, using the data, using computers and statistics to actually analyze things like that. Because that really is, as a well-posed statistical question, that's very testable. You know, we can sort of objectively identify places where we think there's wordplay, and then test. You could use there's various measures of sort of word similarity, and they all have their associated problems. But in general, you can test the similarity between words, and you can sort of measure. So we could create a measurement of words used in puns and their similarity, and versus the similarity of two randomly chosen words, and sort of create a measurement that way that could answer that question.
So this is just a thought, a comment more than a question. But one of the things I thought would be interesting maybe would be to look at the Arabic epic poetic tradition. Because it's a performative, and you have similar wordplay that's being actually done extemporaneously on the spot. So they're medieval epics, and they're bringing people in the audience into the speech act, and so they're punning, there's alliteration, stuff like that. It might be an interesting comparison. I'm not saying that it can survive, but
No, that would be great. Actually, comparisons is something that I really don't think I've spent enough time on comparisons. So that.
When you have the puns and the offering formula, work with an item at the end which matches something in the second beforehand, could you comment on whether you think that could have something to do with the process of memorizing a list? That it's easier to memorize the items in the list if you make some kind of association. So maybe something from the oral tradition with having to recite lists of things.
Actually, that's very good. That's not something I thought of, honestly. My impression was that in the creation of these mythological texts, you're basically pairing sort of arbitrary things, and so if you can choose something that connects them that just seems rational or logical, then that sort of gives that lends weight to the idea that we're actually talking about something that's real, not something that's just sort of far-fetched and illogical. And I also thought that in any Afro-Asiatic language, you have cases where similar sounding words often are meaningful. So you have like bah and buhaira or something. It's like lake and sea are clearly related. One's a diminutive. You can see the relationship, but they don't actually sound that much alike. So using puns to connect ideas in an everyday sense is actually a valuable way to sort of understand the world. So maybe they're bringing that. Whether it was used as a mnemonic, I think that's a really great thing to think about. Not something to comment.
Do you see any kind of wordplay with determiners going on, where they might use a different determiner than the traditional determiner would be to create a juxtaposition?
I'm having trouble picturing what you mean by that. So you would have a sort of an ordinary word, and then you would have an unusual determinative with it. And so a sort of like a visual wordplay on the determiner? I definitely think that happens. And the pyramid text is really the best place to look for that, because you do have these glyphs that only show up once in the entire thing, and they're very visually expressive. That's not something I looked at for this study, because we're interested more in, I mean, the ultimate goal of doing this is to try to answer phonological questions. And I kind of found that visual wordplay doesn't contribute that much to phonological questions, but it's definitely something more. Sir?
Yeah, I like the fact that you mentioned Coptic punning and Arabic punning and such, but just quick suggestion, if you're looking for comparanda for a lot of these examples are I would definitely recommend looking at New Kingdom religious texts, where they have a particularly rich tradition of both punning and alliteration, and it's a little bit closer to
that's definitely something worth looking at. There have been studies done. The one that sort of stands out the most, there's a collection of papers published called Puns and Pundits, and Logredo wrote an essay where he compared puns sort of across the Egyptian corpus. The reason I chose Coptic as a point of comparison is that it has the vowels, basically. And one of my favorite hypotheses that I'm bringing with this is the idea that puns might actually tell us something more about either vowel prosody or rhyme or something about what's going on with the vowels that we can't see. And the Egyptian doesn't really offer that much help.
I'm speaking specifically of Middle Egyptian and Egyptian text, but with regard to what you're saying though, on the pronunciation aspect of things, I'm curious because like the one that sticks in my mind is the Jenekwi Jehuti that you mentioned, the two wings of thought. And you didn't like that example as an example of a pun, and I agree, but it does have alliteration. And I'm not sure that, that there are puns that would rely on pronunciation, but there are also puns that would rely purely on the consonantal structure. And so I think that you can't de-emphasize the importance of puns that maybe would not sound anything alike when pronounced, but in their consonants alone, there's clearly meant to be a connection there. In that particular time, it's definitely alliteration.
Yeah, it is a case of alliteration. My point with this example is basically saying, in deciding whether you're looking at accidental or intentional wordplay, this just sort of emphasizes the difficulty that you encounter there. Puns are wordplay based purely on consonants that wouldn't have sounded a lot alike, certainly existed,